So when I was pretty young, like 12 to 14, pretty much every Friday night, I would spend my evenings going to the local chess club and playing a game of classical chess. We would have like a weeknight tournament that would run for like 9 weeks straight or something, then we'd start like a new one, and this would basically run throughout the year. And it was like a really good thing at the time for me to get like more experience, play stronger players. And I remember especially when I was starting out, there's always some like older guy before the round. He was like reading some book, right? Might have been a like chess strategy or something. He'd have some kids amazed at like whatever he was looking at. And where I want to go with this is that what I unfortunately realized later on was that the guy who was reading the book later, like a year after pretty much once I started playing regularly, I got quite a bit better than him. And he probably knew a lot more about chess than I did. And, he'd probably read dozens, maybe hundreds of books, and I'd never really even touched a single one in my life. What this should show you is that chess is a game of not just knowledge, but skill. And especially chess strategy, you would think that this is an area of chess where having a bunch of knowledge would really help. Like, you need to know how to play this pawn structure, these specific aspects of positional chess, like weak squares and stuff. And definitely that can all help. Having the knowledge probably isn't going to hurt, but in terms of trying to find like the quickest way possible to really improve in this area of your game, you have to treat it like a skill. And I really learned this when I read this book called Grandmaster Preparation Positional Play by Grandmaster Jakob Aagaard. I read this at a time where you see this rating graph here, this my FIDE graph, where I was stuck around 2000 since like early 2017. I dropped down a little bit, came back up, and I finally broke through to 2100. And one of the things I really did at the time was I read this book and started treating positional chess like it was a skill that I had to get better at. And in this video, that's exactly what we are going to do. I'm going to run you through a few examples and show you the right questions to be asking so that you can find in a variety of situations the right moves in a position. And so there are basically three fundamental questions that I want you guys to remember, and we're going to go through these step by step. So first of all, when you reach a sort of position where there aren't many tactics on the board and you have to rely more on your positional understanding or like your positional decision making skills, whatever you want to call it, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, what is my worst placed piece? So going off of this, right, this is the first position that we have. This was actually taken from one of my students' games. And anyways, I basically just want you to think, if you have black here, what are you going to do? So, okay, you should be assessing at this point, like, trying to figure out, like, what's my worst placed piece? And of course, you should keep the bigger picture in perspective. But really, if you just look alone at, like, what is my worst placed piece in this position? Well, there are a few different ones you could say. You could say, like, oh, my bishop's on the back rank still, I need to, like, move it or something. But because bishops are inherently long-range pieces, like, putting it on d7 is not really making it much better than it is on c8, to be honest. So I wouldn't really call this your worst placed piece. In fact, if you move it here or like here, it could even be getting in the way of some of your other pieces. So probably in this exact position, I would say that your worst placed piece is the knight on a6. And unfortunately in the game, my student didn't really fix this issue. He took on e4 and then he like made some exchanges, and like this wasn't terrible by any means, but he didn't really fix the fundamental issue in his position, which was again the knight on a6. Maybe this knight was also kind of not so great, so he did kind of solve that issue. But then again, like when we reach this position, he still didn't solve it. He just was like moving all these pieces, which were already kind of okay, without solving his worst placed piece, and this really came back to hurt him later on in the game. What he should have done in this position is just try and fix it as soon as possible, bring it to b8. We are kind of making it more passive in the moment, but the reality is that no matter what you try to do on a6, it can't really do much. We just need to solve it immediately, and from here we can bring it to d7 and then maybe to f6. So that was definitely one way you could do it, or at least like in this position. Now it's even better because like there's no knight on h5 trying to like get in a fight with this other knight over who gets to go to the f6 square. This is another position. This was taken from a game of mine that I played against an Italian international master, actually, I think in either 2019 or 2020. But yeah, basically think about in this position, like if you have black, what's your worst placed piece and how are you going to fix it? So there's like, again, a few different things you could be thinking of. You could be thinking, oh, like I need to move my queen because like then I connect my rooks. And like, look, that's not necessarily wrong, but in this position, I kind of thought that my knight on g6 was actually my worst placed piece, and the reason was that, okay, it can maybe have some mobility now, but if I give white a tempo to play g3, I thought that this would actually be really annoying because then my knight just basically is paralyzed, and the only legal square it can go to where it doesn't hang itself is h8, and I mean, usually if your knight can only go to h8, that's usually a sign that you've messed up. So instead, what I did was I recognized, like, okay, before he plays g3, maybe I should just exchange my knight off, or at least try to. So that's what I did. I played knight h4, and I was like, if he tries to avoid it and then play g3, well, I can just go to f5, no big deal, and I can like attack this, and I'm probably doing absolutely fine. So he exchanged, and then like we did some stuff, and I ended up being okay. I played f5 to stop him from further marching with his pawns, and I later end up even winning the game, so this was, yeah, a pretty good memory for me. But anyways, on to question number 2. So the second question is, what are your opponent's weaknesses? And also I just want to say, like, sometimes there aren't going to be like any clear answers, or there might be multiple. Like for example with worst placed piece, I mean that can be somewhat subjective, and sometimes also there's not going to be like a clear weakness. There are some positions where genuinely your opponent isn't going to have a clear weakness for you to just like hammer on and completely destroy. But anyways, very often there will be, and these are ultimately just questions to help guide you to the right answer. They're not necessarily going to 100% of the time always make sure that you play like Magnus Carlsen. Unfortunately, I don't know what that algorithm is. So I've stroked my ego enough. Now we're looking at the black side, where I was actually playing white, and I unfortunately lost this game. And it was because my opponent in this position, well, one, I made a positional mistake a few moves ago, but it was a positional mistake because of what my opponent could now do, where he can make use of a weak square I have in my camp. If you'd like to try and have a go at this, I recommend, well, pausing the video. And basically, the problem with white's position is that I have this weak square on f4. And the weak square should usually be defined as like a square where basically no other pawns can cover it up. So as you can see, f4 definitely cannot be covered up by any other pawns. You could maybe say like, I don't know, c3 is a weakness, but realistically, I mean, how are we making use of that, right? It's like, sometimes there's going to be weaknesses which like theoretically are weaknesses, but in practice aren't really, and this is sort of one of those situations, I guess, with c3, but f4 you can definitely use, and he did that very brutally with knight to f8, brought a knight to e6 to f4, and later on I had some chances, but then like I ended up losing, and yeah, it was a very bitter memory for me, but very good example of a weakness and basically just taking, or rather making, direct use of it. So a more recent example of mine, this is a game actually I had with the white pieces I played last month against a FIDE master, and basically it's a sort of like weird Benoni position we have. And yeah, I want you to be thinking though of like, what are our opponent's weaknesses of the position and how can we make use of them? So there's a few different things you could think of. For example, the c6 square is one that I had a student say the other day, and his idea was we could play like knight to b3 to a5 and go into c6. But you have to be careful like in that sort of thinking, because at the same time you also have to be thinking like, okay, if I go for that, is there any way they can just cover up the weakness? And well, the answer is yes, they can play knight e7, which is a developing move they were going to play anyway, and then it doesn't really like this whole maneuver do anything. So that doesn't really lead anywhere, but that's a good thought to be having, at least like, okay, c6, maybe there's one day that we can somehow use that, but in the near future, not exactly right now. However, one thing I did come up with in the game was that this pawn on a7 really does look like a weakness. And you could also maybe say the king side is a little bit weak, but it's actually kind of hard to make use of it because a lot of black's pieces are clustered around there, and I'm basically just going to be outmanned. It's very difficult to make that work. But a7, I thought I could target this. And my way of doing this was with the creative maneuver, you could say, rook to h3, and then swinging my rook all the way over to the a file, where it can basically, in conjunction with this rook on a1, hammer down here and target the a7 pawn. And while I do acknowledge that black can defend it with a move like rook c7 very quickly, this kind of had two purposes, right? It wasn't just to target an opponent's weakness, it was also to make use of one of my worst placed pieces in the position right now, which was this rook on h1 rather, which was doing very little. And number 3 is going to basically be like looking for your opponent's ideas, asking yourself, what is my opponent's idea? If it was their move right now, what would they do? Or maybe like if I did this natural looking thing, what would they do against that? And to be honest, I think that most people in chess, they're so like just thinking about themselves all the time. They're not thinking or giving a single thought even to like even some decent players sometimes, like about what their opponent is gonna do. And really, if you just do this one thing just in chess in general, thinking about like what is it that my opponent is going to do, not just assuming your opponent is an idiot who has like zero intention to do some like evil stuff to you, then you're gonna avoid, to be honest, a lot of pain. So looking at this position, right, you might have noticed by now that white is a pawn up. However, that in this game led white to also be kind of careless and just simply castle. The problem is though is that this didn't at all consider what black might be trying to do, and in the game black just played knight to a5, and this basically has the consequence, right, of like hitting this bishop now, which is kind of loose, which is also protecting knight, which is bishop is attacking, so you can't just move backwards, you have to stay on this diagonal. But if you go backwards, then you like just stay in the diagonal, right, then you lose a piece. And in the game white tried to play b3 so they could go take and then recapture, but unfortunately it didn't really work, because after b5 the bishop is being deflected, and if it takes there's going to be take. So after b5 white just ended up resigning quite sadly, and they could have avoided a lot of this trauma, let's say, if they just asked in this position like what is my opponent's idea. And you can see knight a5, it's not like the most difficult move in the world to see. You can play a3 and then meet knight a5 with bishop a2, you keep the knight protected on the diagonal, and you're just a pawn up. So yeah, in this scenario, pretty simple, but let's move on to a slightly more difficult one for the next position. So this is a position I had in a rapid tournament last year over the board, and basically black's last move was to push their pawn to the c4 square, and of course you want to be looking for like what is my opponent's idea, how do I deal with this, so spend a little bit of time and try to figure that out. So there's an interesting thing going on here, which is that white actually, if you think about it, has an isolated queen's pawn. It's a slightly strange version of the isolated queen's pawn, but it is isolated, and it would be slightly more typical if this pawn was like over here, having a firm blockade over this square. But like, let's say if white just does nothing, we play like pawn to a3 for example, then black is going to go knight to d5, they're going to blockade the isolated pawn, and like, yeah, they're basically going to have a fine position. And like, okay, this is like requires some level of positional understanding, right? But I think, you know, most of you guys watching the video, you sort of understand like, okay, isolated pawn, usually the side playing against it wants to block it, and usually the side playing with it wants to do some like sort of attacking the stuff, right? So basically what I figured that out, and I got to work just trying to figure out like if I can just play d5 and advance the pawn, stopping them from blockading it. And this of course brings up the question of like, well, can they just take it? And like, this isn't something that you can just look at intuitively and be like, no, they can't take it. You actually have to like, you know, get off your ass and look at some stuff and actually calculate. So that's what I did. I started like looking at knight takes d5, and well, I realized like if he doesn't play knight takes d5, right, it's going to be a pretty miserable position. I can go like knight e5, knight d4, and then like get my knight in somewhere, have a strong passed pawn. It's not going to, like, positionally, it's kind of not great for him. So the only serious thing I have to calculate is just taking. Everything else is I just know is like good for me. So the first thing that I looked at was like, if knight takes d5, can I play like knight g5? And I thought this was pretty good at first, because like this is pinned, I'm like threatening mate, and if he goes h6, I can play rook takes d5, I'm hitting the queen with tempo. But then I realized that like he can play h takes g5 there, and well, I am attacking his queen, but my queen's also under attack. I can come over and take that, but then it's just equal material, and I didn't actually win anything because I won a pawn just then, but I also lost a d5 pawn earlier. So net, that means I'm winning nothing, and I didn't actually think I had anything special in that final position after rook takes g5, which I was correct about. But then I realized after knight takes d5, instead of playing this, that I could actually play rook takes d5, queen takes d5, I mean otherwise he's a piece down, like you can exchange queens but it doesn't do anything. Knight to g5 now, this is being attacked and I'm threatening mate, and if queen f5, then I go bishop to e4, and well, there's just no way you can keep the queen alive, or also not getting mated. So in the game that didn't happen. I'm not sure whether he actually saw that whole variation or not, but it is quite scary to take this pawn admittedly, and he ended up playing queen d6, knight d4 happened, knight f5, and life was pretty good. And especially with this example, right, I really want to stress the idea that positional chess isn't just something where you ask yourself a question and you always find the right move. You also have to calculate a little bit often as well to be able to justify the move that is positionally correct, which in this case is d5, because there's a lot of players, right, they're like, I'm a positional player, and in reality that's just code for my positional chess isn't even that good, I'm just too lazy to calculate, so like I guess by subtraction that means like I'm a good positional player. Like that's not how it works, that just means they're bad at chess. But anyways, wrapping up, I want to show one example of a game that happened shortly after I went through the book I mentioned earlier, Grandmaster Preparation, Positional Play, for those of you who forgot. This is the inspiration for basically this video, but this was a middle game position I had. I was playing my first game ever, actually, for context, against this Norwegian international master in Switzerland. It was a really big tournament for me. It was really, I have a lot of nostalgia around it. It was the first time I ever played overseas. I saw like Magnus Carlsen, a bunch of these people. I remember especially like I was having dinner one night and me and my dad, we were eating in this like restaurant at the hotel, and there was like Magnus and he was just like with his parents. It was like, and it was pretty empty as well, the restaurant. Like we could have maybe gone over and just said hi, but I don't know, it was kind of a bit shy at the time, so I didn't really have the nerves to do that, you could say. But while I wasn't quite playing Magnus, I was playing another Norwegian player in this game, of course, again, another international master, and we have sort of a bit of a hedgehog looking structure here, but you can see his pawn is on d6 is right now under attack. So in the game he played bishop to f8, and I just want to show a little bit of this game and show how I applied some of the concepts, and hopefully you guys can join along and try and see if you can use the stuff that we've talked about so far in this video and apply it to this real situation we have on the board right now. So bishop to f8, try and think a little bit about how you would approach this position, again using the 3 questions. What are my opponent's weaknesses? Well, at first it was, what's my worst place piece? What are my opponent's weaknesses? And then what is my opponent's idea? So in this position, first of all, there's no like clear worst piece for white. All of our pieces are pretty good already. We can improve them a bit more, but probably like the things we want to be focusing on are more like what are our opponent's weaknesses and what are our opponent's ideas, to really inform like how we should use our pieces and how we can improve them in a way that make use of those things. But also, if the bishop coming to f8, it's very important to really ask yourself, like, it might seem like they're just defending the pawn on d6, but there are some slightly nefarious intentions they might have with doing so. But before we get to that, number 2, what are our opponent's weaknesses? And I would say again, d6 pawn, which they literally just defended, is something that we should be looking at, but also the b6 pawn. That's something which is also kind of a little bit weak. So it might be tempting, for example, to try and like go maybe, let's say, bishop to f4, and try and immediately attack the pawn on d6 as a weakness. However, this brings us to the third question, which is what is my opponent's idea? And actually the bishop on f8 was not just a defending piece, but actually an attacking piece, because now after takes, for example, if we take bishop takes b4, you can see that it grabs that pawn on b4, and the space advantage white has had is starting to be kind of neutralized by now. Black is getting very active, we can take, but they just take back, and it feels like a lot of white's advantage with the extra space they had has kind of just evaporated into thin air. So in the game I decided, okay, like I can think about my worst piece, my opponent's weaknesses, but for now I need to think about like this, which my opponent's probably going to do next, so I just played a3. A very subtle move, but it's important, I thought, just to defend this pawn. And ironically, it was actually still best for black to go d5, but not because there's some like weird tactics, but basically just because apparently after like takes and like some stuff like this, apparently they have compensation, which okay, fair enough. But yeah, neither of us in the game really understood this, so instead what happened was after a3, queen to c7 happened, and again I'd just like you guys to take a bit of a think now, given that we sort of know like what our opponent's weaknesses are and maybe some of the ideas that we should be watching out for. And again, just using the 3 questions that we've been talking about already at length in this video, again try and think about how you would utilize them to make a move in this position. And so really I wasn't too concerned about any immediate break like b5 or d5 or anything, especially if the queen staring in to the eye of my rook here, I felt that I should be focusing a lot on either A, improving like whatever my worst place piece is, or 2, trying to like target a weakness in the position of blacks. And I felt that number 2 is what I really had to be focusing on, and I figured that really it's kind of difficult to really hammer down on the d6 square. If I go bishop f4, like knight e5 might even be possible now, so I wasn't really too keen on that. Also, I'm not too thrilled about giving them these doubled pawns. I give up my dark squared bishop, which I think is more important. So what I instead did was I played this very subtle move, bishop to f1, and this was the start of a rearrangement of my pieces to actually target the b6 weakness. So we see how this unfolds. Queen to b8, I play queen to f2, he plays bishop to a8, and now the culmination of my whole plan was to play knight to a4, and basically it was just almost impossible for him to really properly defend stuff, because like the only real way to add another defender to the b6 pawn is to play rook c6. But I mean, like, you don't really want to put your rook on c6, right? Like, I'm not sure that I can fully punish this, because if I go b5, for example, take, and this, he might be able to then block the attack on b6 with the knight like this. And if I go like knight d4, he might just be able to go back. But still, like, this isn't really a whole lot of fun for him. And so he ended up in the game going b5 eventually after some thinking. I remember thinking in the game that maybe he'll like try to sacrifice on e4 and then try to like get my queen off this diagonal and then like try and build some big pawn center. But okay, the computer ended up hating this idea, but I thought like maybe it has some merit. But yeah, really what he did in the game though was even worse, because after this, like, he opened up all sorts of bishop a7 ideas and like knight a5 possibilities, where like you can see here, for example, that after takes, his queen is under attack. And in the game I wasn't sure about this, it's like completely winning, but it was tough for me because I could also take on b5 first and then go knight a5 this, and then like basically just like win this and almost trap his queen. So it was very difficult for me to decide it, and at the end of the day I ended up going for this one. But I think the computer liked this a bit more. But long story short, I did end up winning the game after going for this. He had sacrificed the exchange, and then he tried to like do some fancy crap like this, but it didn't end up working. And basically using like these 3 questions, I went from a pretty complex position like from the start here, right, to in the matter of like 5 or 6 moves basically just having a completely dominating winning position against a player who I thought was like much stronger than me, and objectively he probably was, because at the time I was just like 2000, right? So yeah, it was like a very memorable game for me, my first ever time playing in overseas, like in an international tournament, also against like a player 400 points basically higher rated than me. And it was again basically just using the concepts I talked about in this video, in this book. But anyways, if you found this video valuable and you want more help with your game with one-on-one coaching, I do offer that. I have a link in the description below which you can fill out. But anyways, for the rest of you, hope you've enjoyed this. Please like, subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you until next time.